In 1912, a man named Lawrence Oates walked out of a tent into a blizzard and said, "I'm just going outside and maybe sometime." He was never seen again. That line has become one of the most haunting last words in exploration history. But what most people never hear is what came before it. The weeks of starvation, the rotting flesh, the desperate scramble across a continent that does not care whether you live or die. Antarctica is not a place. It is a test. And most people fail it. The continent sits at the bottom of the world, covering about 5.5 million square miles. In winter, that number almost doubles because the surrounding ocean freezes over and extends the landmass outward like a slow exhale. Temperatures at the South Pole drop to minus 89 degrees Celsius, recorded at the Soviet Vostok Station on July 21st, 1983. That is cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 60 seconds, cold enough to make metal brittle, cold enough to make the human body shut down in ways that doctors still do not fully understand. Before you click away, ask yourself this. If governments have been sending expeditions to this continent since the early 1900s, and if science is the only stated reason, then why are so many expedition reports classified? So many deaths listed under vague bureaucratic language, and so many returned researchers refusing to speak about what they saw? Subscribe, because what comes next is going to completely change how you think about the world's most isolated place. In 1947, the United States military launched Operation High Jump. This was not a small research trip. Admiral Richard Byrd led a force of 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft into Antarctic waters. The official story was to establish a research base and test military equipment in cold weather conditions. But here is what the official story leaves out. The operation was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It ended after 8 weeks. Byrd's fleet returned to the United States battered, with at least one aircraft destroyed, and multiple personnel reported dead under circumstances that were never fully clarified in public documents. In a post-mission interview with the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, published in March of 1947, Byrd made a statement that the United States government has never officially addressed. He said that it was necessary for the United States to take defensive actions against enemy fighters that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Byrd was a decorated naval officer. He was not known for dramatic fabrications, but that statement was quietly buried. And High Jump's classified files were not fully reviewed until decades later, with many sections still redacted today. Operation Deep Freeze followed in 1955. This was the successor program, again led by Byrd, and it has never actually ended. It continues today under U.S. naval support. The program funds American research bases on the continent, including McMurdo Station, which sits on Ross Island and currently supports up to 1,200 people during summer operations. But the personnel who cycle through McMurdo are required to sign non-disclosure agreements covering certain categories of observation. Researchers who have returned have spoken vaguely about atmospheric anomalies, unusual geological formations, and unexplained equipment failures that occur in specific zones of the continent. None of this has been formally denied by the military. In 1979, Air New Zealand Flight 901 crashed into Mount Erebus on November 28th, killing all 257 people on board. The official investigation, led by Chief Inspector Ron Chippendale, initially blamed pilot error and crew disorientation. But a second independent investigation by Justice Peter Mahan found that the flight path had been altered in the airline's computer system without notifying the crew, and that the resulting confusion led directly to the crash. Mahan used the phrase, "an orchestrated litany of lies," to describe the airline's initial response. The cover-up was real, it was documented, it was institutional, and it happened at the edge of Antarctica. What makes that crash deeply strange is what the survivors of other flights in the same region have reported over the years. Pilots flying near the continent have logged unexplained compass deviations. Navigation instruments have failed repeatedly in the same geographic corridors. The magnetic South Pole, which is distinct from the geographic South Pole, moves consistently and is currently located off the coast of Antarctica in the Southern Ocean. This movement affects GPS calibration and traditional navigation, but researchers have noted that the degree of instrument failure in certain zones exceeds what magnetic deviation alone can explain. In 1958, a geologist named Nikolai Stulov returned from a Soviet Antarctic expedition with samples from beneath the ice shelf in what is now the Russian-claimed territory near Mirny Station. He died 11 months later of an illness that Soviet records described simply as complications from polar exposure. His research notes were confiscated by the Soviet Ministry of Science and have never been published. A colleague of his, Dr. Alexei Treshnikov, who later became the director of the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute, gave a lecture in 1964 in which he referenced findings from that era that were, in his words, too significant to release at the time. He never elaborated publicly. The Antarctic Treaty was signed on December 1st, 1959, by 12 nations. The treaty designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banning military activity and nuclear testing. It also prohibits any nation from claiming sovereignty over territory. What is unusual is the speed at which it was signed. Negotiations began in 1958 and concluded in just over a year. For context, the United Nations Charter took 2 years to negotiate among far fewer competing interests. The Antarctic Treaty somehow brought the United States and the Soviet Union to agreement during the height of the Cold War, in record time, over a continent that both had shown tremendous military interest in just a decade before. That speed has never been satisfactorily explained by diplomatic historians. The treaty's Article 7 allows for inspections of any facility by any signatory nation. In over 60 years, fewer than 24 formal inspections have been conducted. For a document that was sold as a framework of openness and transparency, that number is extraordinarily low. Several stations, including components of the American Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, have no record of ever being independently inspected. The station was established in 1956 and has operated continuously since. It sits directly atop the geographic South Pole and houses equipment that its personnel describe only in general terms in publicly released documents. Lake Vostok sits beneath 4 kilometers of ice in eastern Antarctica. It is the largest known subglacial lake on Earth, covering an area of about 15,000 square kilometers. Russian scientists began drilling toward it in the 1990s and breached its surface in February of 2012 after decades of work. What they found has been partially published. Microbial life, previously unknown bacterial species, water that had been isolated from the rest of the planet for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. The published findings are remarkable enough, but the unpublished findings, referenced in internal Russian Academy of Sciences memos leaked in 2013, include references to thermal anomalies inconsistent with geothermal modeling and structural formations on the lakebed that require further analysis before classification. Neither of those phrases has appeared in any peer-reviewed paper to date. The drilling team at Vostok was also evacuated abruptly in January of 2012, weeks before the official breach date, due to what was described as equipment malfunction. They returned in February. The gap in the drilling record during that period has never been fully explained by the Russian Antarctic program. A technician who worked on the project, speaking anonymously to a Russian science journalist in 2015, said that the team had encountered something in the ice column that the leadership refused to document in the standard field logs. He did not specify what. In 1997, a research aircraft operating out of McMurdo Station detected what scientists initially believed to be a meteorite impact. The location was approximately 750 miles from the station, in an area of the continent where no ground team had been in years. The seismic signature was real. It was picked up by monitoring stations in New Zealand and Australia. When a ground team was eventually sent to investigate, they found no impact crater, no meteorite fragments, and no conventional geological explanation for the seismic event. The USGS cataloged it, assigned it a file number, and the investigation was formally closed in 2001 with the notation, cause undetermined. Rodney Marks was a 25-year-old Australian astrophysicist stationed at the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station. On May 11, 2000, he collapsed and died. The nearest medical facility capable of a proper autopsy was in Christchurch, New Zealand. His body could not be transported for months due to winter conditions. When the autopsy was finally completed, the cause of death was determined to be methanol poisoning. Methanol is used as an anti-freeze agent in scientific equipment. The question of how a trained scientist came to ingest a fatal dose of methanol has never been answered. New Zealand police investigated and formally concluded in 2006 that there was not enough information available to determine whether his death was accidental, self-inflicted, or the result of another person's actions. One of the most isolated places on Earth produced a death with no clear explanation. The investigation was blocked at every turn by bureaucratic delays, classified personnel records, and the simple fact that the station's occupants had all rotated out by the time investigators had access. Now here's where it gets even stranger. If you are still watching, understand this. The things described so far are documented. They are in public records, official investigations, and academic sources. What comes next is where documentation becomes thinner, but the pattern becomes harder to ignore. In 2004, a satellite mapping project run through the British Antarctic Survey produced thermal imaging of the continent's interior that revealed a series of geometric formations beneath the ice in the Ellsworth mountain range. The shapes were regular enough to prompt internal discussion within the survey team about their origin. The lead researcher, Dr. Ian Todd, filed a report noting that the formations were, in his words, possibly of interest beyond standard glaciological study. That report was not published. It was passed to the UK Ministry of Defence. No follow-up has ever been publicly confirmed. The Ellsworth Mountains were first explored by Lincoln Ellsworth in 1935. The range runs for about 360 kilometers and contains the highest peak in Antarctica, the Vinson Massif, at 4,892 meters. The interior of the range is one of the least surveyed areas of the continent. Ground expeditions into the deep interior are extraordinarily expensive and require permits that, since 2008, are issued by the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat in Buenos Aires. Certain areas require additional clearance through a secondary process that the Secretariat itself describes only as involving consultation with member states. The criteria for that secondary review have never been publicly disclosed. In 2016, John Kerry became the first sitting United States Secretary of State to visit Antarctica. The official reason given was to observe the effects of climate change on the continent's ice sheets. Kerry spent approximately 24 hours on the continent, visiting the New Zealand-operated Scott Base near McMurdo. The timing was notable. It was November 9th, 2016, the day after the U.S. presidential election. The diplomatic press corps traveling with Kerry noted that he spent a significant portion of his visit in meetings that were not on the publicly released schedule, and that no transcript or summary of those meetings has ever been released by the State Department. Buzz Aldrin visited Antarctica in November of 2016 as well, just days after Kerry. He was evacuated on medical grounds after falling ill. Before leaving, he sent a message through a social media account managed by his team that read, "We are all in danger. It is evil itself." The post was deleted within hours. His representatives attributed it to an unauthorized posting by a member of his social media team. Aldrin himself has not commented on the specific content of the post. He was 76 years old at the time and one of only 12 human beings in history to have walked on the moon. The geographic concentration of unexplained events, classified documents, and abrupt institutional silence around Antarctica is not proof of any single theory, but it represents a pattern that, in any other context, would generate far more investigative scrutiny than it has. The continent is governed by a treaty that prioritizes scientific access but structurally discourages transparency. It houses equipment and personnel under agreements that restrict public disclosure. It has produced deaths that remain officially unexplained, seismic events that remain officially unclassified, and satellite data that has been routed directly to defense ministries rather than scientific journals. The ice itself is a record of Earth's history going back 800,000 years. The air bubbles trapped in Antarctic ice cores contain samples of ancient atmosphere that have told us more about historical climate than almost any other source on the planet. The European project for ice coring in Antarctica, known as EPICA, drilled a core at Dome C in eastern Antarctica that reached a depth of 3,270 meters and provided a continuous climate record going back 740,000 years. Published in Nature in 2004, it remains one of the most significant scientific achievements of the 21st century. That is real. That is verifiable. That is what Antarctica can do when research is open. The question is what it conceals when research is not. In 1961, a Soviet geologist named Yevgeny Tolstikov led a traverse from Mirny Station into the deep interior and documented a plateau region that he described in his field notes as having characteristics that did not correspond to existing geological models of the continent. Those notes were published in a Soviet scientific journal in a heavily edited form. The original field notes, held at the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in St. Petersburg, were reviewed by a Norwegian researcher in 2009 who noted that entire sections had been removed from the published version. The Norwegian researcher's own subsequent paper, which referenced this discrepancy, was rejected by 3 separate journals before being published in a minor Scandinavian geography periodical in 2011. The paper has received fewer than 40 academic citations. The hardest thing to accept about Antarctica is not any single event or document. It is the sheer consistency of the pattern. Nations that compete on every other stage of geopolitics agree, with unusual speed, to limit access to this continent. Deaths that occur there are harder to investigate than deaths anywhere else on Earth. Equipment fails in ways that exceed physical explanations. Researchers return and go quiet. Data gets classified before it gets published. In 1929, Richard Byrd flew over the South Pole for the first time in human history. In the cockpit with him was a Norwegian pilot named Bernt Balken, who said after the flight that what he saw from the air over the interior did not match the terrain described in earlier cartographic surveys. He could not explain the discrepancy. He did not try to explain it. He simply noted it and said nothing further in any public forum for the rest of his life. Antarctica holds 90% of the world's fresh water. It contains coal deposits that suggest it was once a forested continent. It is the only landmass on Earth with no indigenous human population. No one has ever lived there permanently without support from the outside world. It exists, fully, outside the human story. And yet governments have spent billions of dollars, sent thousands of people, and signed binding international agreements specifically to manage who goes there and what they find. The last verified words of Henry Worsley, a British explorer who died attempting to cross Antarctica solo on January 24th, 2016, were relayed via satellite phone to his wife. He said that he had been defeated by the continent. He died 6 days later in a hospital in Punta Arenas, Chile, from peritonitis and exhaustion. He was 55 years old, He had reached 90% of the crossing distance. The continent took him at the finish line. In 2023, a research paper published by a team from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand documented a previously unmapped river system beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet stretching for more than 1,000 kilometers. The river had been flowing, hidden under ice, for an unknown period. It is one of the longest subglacial river systems ever identified on Earth. It was discovered not by a ground expedition, but by satellite radar imaging, because the ground itself remains too dangerous and too restricted to explore directly. We have mapped the surface of Mars in greater detail than we have mapped the floor of Antarctica's interior. We have sent more robotic missions to the outer planets than we have sent ground teams to the deep interior of the southernmost continent on our own planet. That is not an accident. That is a choice. Choices of that scale, made consistently over more than a century by competing governments who agree on almost nothing else, are not made by coincidence. They are made because something is worth protecting, or because something is worth hiding. Lawrence Oates walked into that blizzard so his teammates might have a better chance of survival. He calculated that his death might buy them enough time and enough food to make it back to the ship. He was wrong. They all died anyway. His sacrifice was real and it changed nothing. That is the truth Antarctica keeps offering, over and over to anyone who gets close enough to see it clearly. The continent does not negotiate.